The digital clock on the dashboard of the bus had mocked Caleb every second of the crawl through downtown Seattle. By the time he hit the pavement at Capitol Hill, the rain was coming down in sheets, that heavy Pacific Northwest gray that soaked through everything in seconds. He ran 3 blocks, his cheap dress shoes skidding on the wet sidewalk. His lungs burned. He checked his watch as he reached the door of the Starbucks. 6:20 p.m. He was 20 minutes late. Caleb paused for a second at the glass, trying to catch his breath. He looked at his reflection and winced. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his discount store blazer was heavy with rainwater, smelling faintly of damp wool. He looked exactly like what he was, a man barely holding it together. This was all Brad's fault. At 4:55 p.m., just as Caleb was reaching for his coat, Brad had dropped a stack of internship reports on his desk. "Miller, I need these digitized and filed before you head out," Brad had said, leaning against the cubicle wall with a smirk. "Brad, I really need to go. I have a personal commitment," Caleb had replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Personal commitments don't pay the rent, Caleb. The company does. Get it done." Brad knew. He had seen the sticky note on Caleb's monitor about the 6 p.m. meeting. He had watched Caleb work through his lunch break and decided to break him anyway. Caleb had stayed, his fingers flying over the keyboard, heart hammering against his ribs, because losing this job meant losing the only roof over his daughter's head. Caleb pushed the door open. The warmth of the coffee shop hit him, smelling of roasted beans and steam. He scanned the tables and saw her immediately. Evelyn Vance sat in a corner booth, tucked away from the crowd. She didn't look like the woman his sister Sarah had described. Sarah had said she was a quiet nurse, but the woman sitting there looked like she stepped off the cover of a high-end business magazine. Her black coat was tailored perfectly, her hair was gathered in a flawless, tight bun, and her expression was as cold as the rain outside. Caleb approached the table, feeling every bit of the gap between them. He was a file clerk with a soaked jacket. She was something else entirely. "I'm incredibly sorry," Caleb said, his voice slightly uneven as he reached the table. "Traffic was a nightmare, and my boss, he had an emergency at the last minute." Evelyn didn't look up from her tea for a long moment. When she finally raised her eyes, they were sharp and unreadable. 20 minutes, Mr. Miller," she said. "I know. I really am sorry. I don't like being late. It's unprofessional. Sit down, Caleb. You're dripping on the floor." Caleb sat, feeling the squelch in his shoes. He put his hands on the table, then quickly pulled them back when he realized they were still shaking from the adrenaline of the run. He tucked them into his lap, hidden under the table. "Can I get you something? A coffee? A tea?" Caleb asked. "I already have my tea. And you look like you need to dry off before you worry about me." Caleb grabbed a handful of napkins from a nearby stand and started dabbing at his face and hair. He felt humiliated. He had spent an hour ironing his shirt this morning, and now he looked like a drowned rat. He caught Evelyn watching him, her gaze lingering on his worn-out cuffs. "Sarah told me you work at Aegis Global," Evelyn said. "I do. In the records department. It's not fancy, but it keeps the lights on. And your boss, the one with the emergency? Brad. He's a difficult man to say no to. Usually, people who can't say no find themselves being walked over," Evelyn said flatly. Caleb felt a sting of defensive anger, but he pushed it down. She wasn't wrong. He was being walked over every single day. "I have a daughter to think about," Caleb said. "Sometimes saying no is a luxury I can't afford." Evelyn's expression shifted, just a fraction. She set her teacup down and leaned back, crossing her arms. For the first time, she looked at him with something other than irritation. She looked at him like he was a puzzle she was trying to solve. "Sarah mentioned you were a widower," she said. 6 years now. It's just been me and Ava." Evelyn didn't offer the usual "I'm sorry for your loss." Instead, she reached for the zipper of her high-collared jacket. Caleb watched, confused, as she slowly pulled it down and shifted her sleeve. "If we're going to talk about luxury and reality, Caleb, let's get to the point," she said. She pulled the fabric back, exposing her shoulder and the top of her arm. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. From the edge of her collarbone down to her elbow, the skin was a map of thick, silver-red scar tissue. It was the kind of damage that only came from a massive, violent heat. Evelyn looked him straight in the eye, her voice devoid of emotion. "No one wants to date me, Mr. Miller," she said. "I figured I'd save us both some time. If you want to leave, I understand. Most men do." Evelyn's sleeve was still pulled back, exposing the silver and red skin that stretched across her forearm. She sat perfectly still, her eyes locked on Caleb's face, waiting for the familiar shift. She was looking for the moment his eyes would dart to the exit, or the way his posture would stiffen before he made a polite excuse about an early morning. Caleb didn't move. He didn't blink. He reached out, not to touch the scar, but to gently push her sleeve back down to her wrist. "I'm not going anywhere, Evelyn," Caleb said. Evelyn pulled her hand back, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "You don't have to stay to be a nice guy. I've seen that look too. The pity. It's just as bad as the staring." "It's not pity," Caleb said. "I've spent the last 6 years looking at skin just like yours, every single night." Evelyn stopped mid-breath. Her sharp, defensive expression faltered. "What do you mean?" Caleb leaned forward, resting his rough, calloused hands on the table. "My daughter, Ava. She was 3 when it happened. We were living in a cheap apartment complex in Kent. The wiring was old, and a fire started in the kitchen while we were asleep. I woke up to the smell of smoke and the sound of the ceiling cracking." He looked down at his hands, his voice dropping an octave. "I got Ava out. I threw a blanket over her and ran through the hallway, but the fire was already too big. My wife, she didn't make it out. I tried to go back in, but the roof came down. Ava survived, but she didn't get away clean. She has scars just like yours, from her shoulder down to her ribs." Evelyn's gaze softened. She looked at the Americano sitting between them, the steam long gone. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Ava is 6 now," Caleb continued. "She's starting to realize she doesn't look like the other kids. She comes home from school and hides in her room. Last week, she told me she didn't want to go to the park anymore because some kid called her a monster. She calls them her monster marks now. She thinks she's broken, Evelyn. She thinks the world is always going to be afraid of her." "It's a hard thing to unlearn," Evelyn said. "People look at the damage and they forget there's a person underneath it." "I tell her the same thing every night," Caleb said. "I tell her those marks aren't something to hide. I tell her they're medals. You survived something that would have destroyed most people. You went through the fire and you came out the other side. You're sitting here, you're running a massive company, and you're still standing." Caleb met her eyes again, his gaze steady and honest. "That doesn't make you a monster, Evelyn. That makes you a warrior. That's all I see when I look at you. I see someone who fought for her life and won." The noise of the Starbucks seemed to drop away. The espresso machine hissed in the distance, and rain continued to drum against the large glass windows. But Evelyn felt like she was in a vacuum. For 8 years, she had carried her scars like a secret shame. She had built Aegis Global into a fortress, using her success to keep people at a distance so they could never get close enough to see the monster. Every man she had tried to date had either looked at her with revulsion or treated her like a tragic project to be fixed. None of them had ever looked at her and seen strength. "You really mean that?" Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. "I do," Caleb said. "I'm just a guy who works in your records department, and I don't have much. But I know what a warrior looks like. I see one every day when my daughter gets out of bed and decides to face the world again. And I see one sitting across from me right now." Evelyn reached for her cold coffee. Her hand, which had been trembling since she pulled up her sleeve, was finally still. She took a small sip, her eyes never leaving Caleb's. For the first time since the fire, the weight in her chest felt a little lighter. She didn't feel the need to pull her collar up or hide her arm under the table. "Sarah was right about you," Evelyn said, her voice finally losing its icy edge. "She said you were different. I'm just a dad trying to do right by his kid," Caleb said. "And maybe I'm tired of being lonely too." Evelyn really looked at him past the wet jacket and the tired eyes. She saw the man who had run into a burning building and the man who spent his nights convincing a little girl she was beautiful. "I think I'd like to hear more about Ava," Evelyn said. Caleb smiled. And for the first time that evening, the tension between them completely vanished. "She'd like that. She's got a lot of stories, mostly about how I'm not very good at drawing horses." The memory of the quiet conversation at Starbucks felt like a dream by the time Caleb stepped off the Sounder train in downtown Seattle. The warmth of Evelyn's gaze was replaced by the cold, damp air of Monday morning and the looming shadow of the Aegis Global Tower. He smoothed out his iron shirt, hoping the day would pass without incident. Caleb sat at his desk in the records department, a windowless corner of the 15th floor filled with the hum of servers and the smell of old paper. He had been there for 20 minutes, meticulously sorting through the backlog of internship reports Brad had dumped on him Friday night. A shadow fell over his cubicle. Caleb didn't have to look up to know who it was. He smelled the expensive cologne first, followed by the sound of a plastic lid popping. "Whoops," Brad said. Caleb jumped back as a stream of lukewarm latte splashed across his desk. The brown liquid soaked into the reports he had just finished organizing and dripped onto his lap. Brad stood there, holding an empty cup with a look of fake surprise on his face. Trevor, Brad's favorite sycophant from the sales floor, stood right behind him, snickering. My hand slipped. "Miller." "Guess I'm a little shaky this morning," Brad said. Caleb grabbed a box of tissues and started dabbing at the documents. "I just finished these, Brad. It's going to take me an hour to reprint and resort everything. Then, you better get started. Accuracy is everything in records, right?" Brad leaned against the cubicle partition, looking Caleb up and down. "So, how was the big date? Did the date laugh at your thrift store suit? Or did she actually stick around long enough to see what you drive?" Trevor chimed in, leaning over Brad's shoulder. "I saw that Ford in the parking lot this morning. It sounded like a lawnmower with a bad muffler. How does that thing even pass an emissions test? I'd be embarrassed to be seen in it." Caleb kept his head down, wiping the coffee off his keyboard. "It gets me from Kent to Seattle. It's reliable enough for what I need." "Reliable? It's a junk pile," Brad said, his voice getting louder so the other clerks could hear. "Stick to filing, buddy. Luxury isn't for people who live on food stamps." "You're a clerk, Miller. You're the guy who handles the paperwork for the people who actually make the money. Don't go thinking you're something you're not just because you got a pity date." Caleb didn't look up. He didn't defend himself. He knew that if he snapped, he'd give Brad exactly what he wanted, a reason to go to HR. He thought about Ava's school tuition. He thought about the rent. He thought about the color of the new markers he wanted to buy her for her birthday. "I'll have these cleaned up and filed by noon," Caleb said quietly. "See that you do," Brad said, tossing his empty cup onto Caleb's desk. "And try not to smell like a Starbucks spill all day. It's unprofessional." Brad and Trevor walked away, their laughter echoing down the hallway. Caleb took a deep breath, stood up, and went to the break room to get more paper towels. He worked in silence, drying off each page that could be saved and reprinting the ones that were ruined. He worked with a steady hand, placing every document in its exact place. 30 floors above him, the atmosphere was different. The executive suite was silent, decorated with minimalist furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the gray Seattle skyline. Evelyn Vance stood in front of a wall of monitors. She wasn't looking at the stock market or the morning news. She was watching a live feed of the 15th floor records department. She saw Caleb on the screen. He was kneeling on the floor, wiping coffee off the carpet. Chloe stood behind her, holding a tablet. "He's been cleaning for 10 minutes. Brad Smith has been hovering over that department all morning." "I see him," Evelyn said. Her voice was flat, her eyes fixed on the small figure of Caleb. "I ran the numbers you asked for," Chloe said, tapping her screen. "Caleb Miller is our most efficient clerk. His error rate is 0.02% over the last 3 years. He's technically overqualified for the position, but he never applies for promotions. Because he's afraid of losing the stability he has," Evelyn said. On the monitor, Caleb sat back down and began typing. He looked tired, but his movements were precise. He didn't look like a man who had been humiliated. He looked like a man who was focused on a goal that Brad couldn't even see. "Brad Smith's department hit its quarterly targets," Chloe added. but the turnover rate in his section is 30% higher than the company average. There are 4 pending complaints about his management style. Keep the footage, Evelyn said, turning away from the screens, and find out exactly what those internship reports were. I want to know why a senior manager is hand-delivering basic filing to a records clerk. Yes, ma'am, Chloe said. Evelyn walked over to the window and watched the rain streak across the glass. She thought about Caleb's words from the night before. You're a warrior. She looked at her reflection in the glass and adjusted her sleeve, making sure the scar was completely covered. Downstairs, a man was fighting a war in a cubicle, and he was doing it for a little girl who called her scars monster marks. Chloe, Evelyn said without turning around, cancel my lunch meeting. I have some reading to do on the 15th floor's filing system. Evelyn watched the monitor until Caleb finished cleaning the coffee spill and returned to his seat. She turned back to her desk and opened the digital HR folder Chloe had sent over. She stared at the phone number listed under Caleb's contact information, memorizing the digits before closing the laptop. She waited until she was home in her penthouse, overlooking the Elliott Bay, before she reached for her personal phone. The city lights were blurred by the constant Seattle drizzle, making the world outside look like a smear of gray and gold. She sat on her sofa, still in her work clothes, feeling the silence of the large apartment pressing in on her. She took a deep breath and typed out a message. It's Evelyn. From the coffee shop. I hope your Monday was better than the weather. In a small, 2-bedroom apartment in Kent, Caleb was sitting at his kitchen table. A bowl of lukewarm mac and cheese sat in front of him, half-eaten. His phone buzzed against the wood. He frowned, seeing an unknown number, then felt a strange jolt of energy when he read the name. Hey, it was a long day, but I'm finally home. How was yours? Evelyn looked at the reply. She felt a small, unfamiliar flutter in her chest. She hadn't expected him to answer so quickly. Busy. The corporate world doesn't stop for rain. Did your boss give you any more emergencies today? Caleb sighed, looking at his red, irritated palms from the cleaning chemicals he'd used earlier. He found a few ways to keep me busy. Let's just say I'm glad to be in my own kitchen right now. Ava is finally asleep. It's the only time the house is actually quiet. Evelyn leaned back against the cushions. She thought about her own house, which was always quiet, and how that quiet usually felt like a weight. Talking to Caleb made it feel different. What was she doing before she went to bed? Drawing. Always drawing. She's obsessed with the new sketchbook I got her. She told me she wanted to draw a picture of the warrior lady I told her about. I think you made an impression. Evelyn stared at the screen. A warrior lady. She looked at her reflection in the dark window of her living room. She didn't feel like a warrior. She felt like a woman who had spent too many years hiding behind a desk and a title. I hope I lived up to the description. I'm not sure I've ever been a character in a 6-year-old story before. You're a hero to her already, Evelyn. Just knowing someone else has scars made her stand a little taller today. She didn't even want to wear her long-sleeved shirt to school this morning. I had to convince her because it was only 50 degrees out. That's a big step. You should be proud. I am. I just wish I could do more. Sometimes it feels like I'm running a race where the finish line keeps moving. I stopped at Target on the way home tonight. Ava's birthday is in 2 weeks. She's been asking for that big Crayola box, the one with 64 colors and the sharpener built into the back. Evelyn smiled. She remembered that box. It was the gold standard of childhood. The 64-pack is serious business. Did you get it? I did. It took a bit of maneuvering. I had to skip lunch for the last 3 days to make the numbers work, but I got it. It's hidden on the top shelf of the closet. I keep imagining the look on her face when she sees all those colors. It's going to be worth the hunger pangs. Evelyn felt a sharp pang in her heart that had nothing to do with hunger. She thought about the catered lunch she had barely touched today, expensive artisan sandwiches and organic salads that she had thrown in the trash because she wasn't hungry. She felt a wave of shame. Here was a man who was literally starving himself so his daughter could have a box of crayons. Caleb, that's a lot to do for a box of crayons. It's not just crayons to her. It's the ability to draw the world exactly how she sees it. In our house, we don't have much, but I try to make sure she has the tools to be whoever she wants to be. If I have to eat a few less sandwiches to make that happen, it's a trade I'll make every single time. You don't think about yourself much, do you? I don't have time to. Between the commute, the filing, and being a dad, there's not a lot of Caleb time left in the day. But that's okay. This is the life I have. I'm just trying to make it a good one for her. Evelyn typed and deleted 3 different responses. She wanted to offer him money, but she knew he would refuse. She wanted to tell him who she was, but she was afraid he would stop talking to her the moment he realized he was texting his boss. She didn't want to lose this, the honesty, the lack of corporate posturing. My parents were the same way, Evelyn wrote. They didn't have much, but I never felt poor. I only realized how hard they worked after they were gone. They made me feel like I was the center of the world. It's a gift that stays with you forever. I hope so. I worry about her all the time. I worry about what happens when I'm not there to protect her from the Brads of the world. There are people who will see her the way you do, Caleb. You just have to find them. I found you, didn't I? Sarah actually did something right for once. Evelyn felt a warm flush creep up her neck. She put the phone down for a second, trying to compose herself. She felt a connection to this man that she hadn't felt with anyone in years. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I'm glad she did, Evelyn replied. I haven't talked to anyone like this in a long time. It's nice to not have to be on for a change. I get that. At work, I'm just Miller. At home, I'm Dad. It's nice to just be Caleb for a few minutes. Evelyn looked at the time. It was nearly midnight. She had a board meeting at 8 a.m., and she knew Caleb had to be up even earlier to catch the train. You should get some sleep, Caleb. You have a long commute tomorrow. You're right. The Sounder train waits for no one. Good night, Evelyn. Evelyn gripped her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. She wanted to say something that would stick with him, something to counter the insults he'd endured at the office. You're a good dad, Caleb. Don't let the world tell you otherwise. She waited. A minute later, a final text came through. Thanks, Evelyn. That means more than you know. Good night. Evelyn set the phone on her nightstand and pulled the silk sheets up. The apartment was still quiet, but for the first time, it didn't feel quite so empty. She thought about Caleb and Kent, probably sleeping in a small bed in a small apartment, dreaming of 64 colors of crayons. She closed her eyes and, for the first time in years, she didn't think about the fire. She thought about the warrior lady in a 6-year-old's drawing. The midnight texts had become a routine throughout the week, turning from brief check-ins into long conversations that lasted until Caleb's eyes grew heavy. By the time Saturday arrived, the prospect of meeting in person felt less like a second date and more like a reunion. After 5 nights of staring at a glowing phone screen, Caleb finally saw Evelyn Vance in the bright, unfiltered daylight of Volunteer Park. It was one of those rare Seattle afternoons where the clouds vanished, leaving the sky a crisp, pale blue. The park was crowded with people lying on blankets and dogs chasing frisbees near the conservatory. Caleb sat on a patch of dry grass near a large oak tree, his back against the bark. Ava sat between his legs, her small hands gripped tightly around her sketchbook. She was wearing a t-shirt, but she had her hair pulled forward to cover the right side of her face. Is she coming, Daddy? Ava asked. She'll be here soon, kiddo. She said she's just parking the car, Caleb said. Is she going to be wearing a dress? I don't know. Maybe. Caleb looked toward the paved path and saw a woman walking toward them. He almost didn't recognize her. Evelyn wasn't wearing the tailored black coat or the flawless bun from the coffee shop. She was wearing a faded gray hoodie with the sleeves pushed up to her elbows and a pair of dark jeans. Her hair was down, falling over her shoulders in loose waves. She looked like any other person enjoying the weekend, not the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. As Evelyn got closer, Ava ducked her head and shifted closer to Caleb, hiding her face against his arm. Hey, Caleb said, standing up as Evelyn reached them. Hey, yourself, Evelyn said. She looked at Caleb, and then down at Ava. And you must be Ava. Ava didn't answer. She gripped the hem of Caleb's shirt and peeked out with one eye. She's a little shy today, Caleb said. That's okay. I'm a little shy too, Evelyn said. Evelyn didn't wait for an invitation. She sat down directly on the grass, about 3 feet away from them. She didn't seem to care about her jeans getting grass stains. She sat cross-legged and placed a small paper bag on the ground. "I heard it was someone's birthday soon," Evelyn said. "I brought some cookies from that bakery on 15th. They told me the chocolate chip ones were the best." Ava's head popped up at the mention of cookies. She looked at the bag and then at Evelyn. "Daddy said you have marks like me," Ava said. Her voice was small but direct. "I do," Evelyn said. "Can I see?" Evelyn didn't hesitate. She reached for the hem of her hoodie and pulled the left side of the collar down. She also pushed her left sleeve all the way to her shoulder. The sunlight hit the scar tissue, making the silver and red ridges of the skin stand out clearly. It was a large, jagged area that covered her shoulder and moved down her arm. Ava let go of Caleb's shirt and crawled forward a few inches. She stared at Evelyn's arm for a long time. She reached out a finger, stopped, and then looked at Evelyn for permission. Evelyn nodded. Ava touched the edge of the scar, her small hand contrasting with the rough texture of Evelyn's skin. "Does it hurt?" Ava asked. "Not anymore," Evelyn said. "It used to. It was very sore for a long time, but now it's just a reminder that I'm still here. Just like you, Ava. We're both still here. The boys at school call me scary," Ava said. "People say mean things when they're afraid of what they don't understand," Evelyn said. "They see the marks, and they don't see the girl who survived a fire. But I see her. And your dad sees her." Ava pulled her hair back from her face, exposing the scars on her cheek and neck. She didn't try to hide them. She looked at Evelyn with a serious, focused expression. "Daddy says we're warriors," Ava said. "He's right," Evelyn said, "and warriors need to keep their strength up. Do you want a cookie?" Ava nodded and reached into the bag. She took a cookie and handed one to Caleb before taking one for herself. The tension that had been hovering over them since Evelyn arrived started to dissipate. "So, I heard you got a new box of crayons," Evelyn said, looking at the sketchbook. "The 64-pack?" Ava said, her mouth full of cookie. She scrambled back to her bag and pulled out the gold and green box Caleb had bought by skipping his lunches. She opened it proudly, showing off the rows of perfectly pointed wax tips. "It's even got the sharpener on the back." "That is a very high-quality piece of equipment," Evelyn said. "What are you drawing?" "I'm drawing the park, but I can't draw the trees right. They look like lollipops. Can I try?" Evelyn asked. Ava handed her a dark green crayon. Evelyn took it and moved closer, sitting right next to Ava on the grass. Caleb watched as the CEO of Aegis Global began sketching a rough outline of a cedar tree. She wasn't an artist, but she worked with a steady hand. Soon, the two of them were huddled over the sketchbook, debating whether the sky should be cerulean or dandelion yellow. Caleb leaned back against the oak tree and just watched. He watched Evelyn laugh when Ava told her the tree needed more fluff. He watched the way Evelyn didn't flinch when Ava's shoulder brushed against hers. He watched his daughter, who usually spent her days trying to disappear, pointing at the colors and talking about her favorite cartoons. "You're doing it wrong, Evelyn," Ava said. "The sun needs a face." "A face? Okay, what kind of face?" Evelyn asked. "A happy one, with sunglasses." Evelyn picked up the yellow crayon and dutifully drew a sun with a wide grin and black shades. Caleb felt a strange, tight sensation in his chest. For years, it had just been him and Ava against a world that felt cold and judgmental. He had grown used to the isolation, to the feeling that they were a broken unit that would never be whole again. But as he looked at Evelyn sitting there in her hoodie, her scarred arm resting near his daughter's, the isolation felt like it was finally beginning to crack. It wasn't a grand realization. There were no fireworks or dramatic music. It was just the sight of 3 people sitting on a patch of grass in Seattle, sharing a box of crayons and some cookies. "Look, Daddy!" Ava shouted, holding up the book. Caleb looked at the drawing. It was a mess of green scribbles, a smiling sun, and 3 stick figures standing under a tree. 2 big ones and 1 little one. They were all holding hands. "That looks great, Ava," Caleb said. He looked at Evelyn. She was looking back at him, her eyes soft. The coldness she carried at the office was gone. She looked relaxed, her hoodie sleeves still pushed up, her scars out in the open. She reached out and ruffled Ava's hair. "We make a good team," Evelyn said. "The best," Ava agreed. Caleb looked away for a second, clearing his throat. The feeling was unmistakable. It was the feeling of safety. It was the feeling of a family starting to form out of the pieces they had left. He didn't know where it was going or how it would work, but as the sun began to dip behind the conservatory, he knew he didn't want the afternoon to end. Caleb walked through the glass doors of Aegis Global on Monday morning with his head held a little higher. He still had the chocolate chip cookie crumbs in his car from Saturday, and Ava hadn't stopped talking about the sun with sunglasses. He sat at his desk and started his computer, feeling like the office didn't have the same power over him anymore. He didn't notice Brad standing by the break room window, clutching a lukewarm coffee. Brad had been there since 7:30 a.m. He had watched a sleek black Tesla drop Caleb off near the Sounder Station entrance. He didn't see the driver, but he saw the way Caleb waved goodbye. He knew Caleb didn't have friends with $80,000 cars. Brad walked over to Caleb's cubicle a few minutes later. "Miller, you're moving up in the world. Who was the lady in the Tesla this morning? I didn't know records clerks had friends with six-figure cars." Caleb didn't look up from his screen. "She's just a friend, Brad. I'm just trying to get through these files." "A friend? Right. Probably some charity case helping out the poor single dad. It's pathetic, really. You think a car like that makes you one of us?" "I don't think I'm anyone but myself, Brad. I have work to do." "Yeah, you do. Make sure you don't mess it up. I've got my eye on you." Brad walked away, but he didn't go back to his office. He waited. When Caleb stood up to go to the restroom 10 minutes later, Brad moved. He slipped into Caleb's cubicle and pulled a thick blue folder from under his blazer. It was the Q3 tax audit, a document that wasn't supposed to leave the executive floor. He shoved it deep into Caleb's bottom drawer, hiding it under a stack of old insurance forms. An hour later, the quiet hum of the office was shattered. Brad came marching out of his office, his face red. "Where is it, Miller?" Brad shouted. Caleb looked up, confused. "Where is what?" "The Q3 tax file. I left it right here on your desk an hour ago for you to scan. It's a confidential document. It's worth millions to our competitors. You didn't give me any tax file, Brad. You haven't been over here since we talked about the car. Don't lie to me. I have witnesses who saw me carrying it toward this department." Brad turned to the rest of the office. "Trevor, did you see me with the blue folder this morning?" Trevor stood up from his desk across the aisle. "Yeah, Brad, I saw you bring it over here around 9. "I never saw it," Caleb said. He stood up, his heart starting to race. "Check the logs. Check my desk. I don't have it." "Oh, we're going to check," Brad said. By now, the commotion had drawn a crowd. About 30 people from the sales and accounting departments had gathered around the cubicle. They stood in a circle, whispering and pointing. Some of them looked worried, but most were just watching the show. "Step aside, Miller," Brad said. He pushed past Caleb and started tossing papers off the desk. He ripped open the top drawer and slammed it shut. Then he reached for the bottom one. Brad reached in and pulled out the blue folder. He held it up like a trophy. "Look at this. Tucked away at the bottom of the drawer. You were planning on taking this home, weren't you?" Caleb felt the air leave his lungs. "I didn't put that there. I've never seen that folder in my life. It's in your desk, Miller, under your personal papers. What were you going to do? Sell it? Or were you just trying to sabotage the audit to get back at me? Brad, listen to me. I don't even have access to those files. Why would I steal something I can't even use? Because you're desperate. You're drowning in debt and looking for a way out. You think we don't know how much you owe the state in back taxes? That's a lie. I don't owe anyone anything. Save it for HR, Brad yelled. He turned to the crowd, making sure everyone was watching. You're a thief, Miller. Poor and dishonest. I knew you were a loser, but I didn't think you were a criminal. I'm calling security. Brad, stop. Think about what you're doing. I have a daughter. I need this job. Maybe you should have thought about her before you started stealing from the company that feeds you. Get your stuff and get out of my sight. Trevor, call the front desk. Tell them we have a security breach in records." Caleb looked at the faces in the crowd. No one spoke up. Trevor was already on the phone, a smirk on his face. The other employees looked away, avoiding Caleb's eyes. He felt a wave of cold horror wash over him. He thought of Ava. He thought of her school and her crayons. "I didn't do this," Caleb said, his voice trembling. "Tell it to the police," Brad said. "Security is on their way." Brad stood over Caleb's desk, clutching the blue tax folder like it was a weapon. The crowd of 30 employees pressed closer, their faces a mix of shock and morbid curiosity. Caleb sat in his chair, his hands flat on the desk, trying to keep his breathing steady. "I'm not waiting for security," Brad yelled. "Marcus, get over here and take him to the holding room." Now, Marcus, the silver-haired security guard who had worked at Aegis Global for 20 years, stepped forward. He looked at the folder in Brad's hand and then at Caleb. Marcus knew Caleb. He knew about the Sounder train commutes and the pictures of Ava that Caleb kept in his wallet. "Brad, let's take a breath," Marcus said. "We can go to my office and call HR. There's no need to make a scene in the middle of the floor. The scene is already made. Marcus." He stole confidential tax audits. "Move him." Marcus stepped between Brad and Caleb. "I'm not putting him in cuffs until I see the footage from the hallway cameras." "Just calm down." Brad's face turned a darker shade of red. "You're an hourly guard, Marcus. Don't tell me how to run my department." Brad reached out and shoved Marcus. It wasn't enough to knock the older man down, but it was enough to push him out of the way. Marcus stumbled back, hitting the side of a cubicle. Caleb stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. "Don't touch him, Brad," Caleb said. "Or what? You'll steal my wallet next?" Brad laughed, looking to Trevor for support. Trevor laughed along, but his eyes were darting around the room. Then, a crisp, metallic chime echoed through the floor. It was the sound of the executive elevator, the one that required a special keycard and bypassed every floor except the penthouse and the lobby. It never stopped on the 15th floor. The heavy brushed steel doors slid open. Evelyn Vance stepped out. She was wearing a tailored navy suit that looked like it cost more than Caleb's car. Her hair was back in that flawless, tight bun. Behind her stood Chloe, clutching a sleek black tablet. The office went silent. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy. People who had been whispering a second ago suddenly found interest in their shoes. Brad froze, his hands still gripping the blue folder. Evelyn didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at Marcus, who was straightening his uniform. She walked with a steady, clicking rhythm of her heels across the carpet. She walked straight past Brad, ignoring him like he was a piece of furniture, and stopped at Caleb's desk. Caleb looked at her, his heart hammering in his chest. "Evelyn?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at his desk, then at the tissues he had used to wipe up the coffee earlier. She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out something small and colorful. It was a plastic butterfly hair clip. It was bright pink and had a little bit of glitter on the wings. It was Ava's favorite. "Caleb, Ava dropped this in my car yesterday," Evelyn said. Her voice was clear and calm, carrying easily through the silent office. "I thought you'd want to bring it home to her. She seemed pretty upset about losing it when we were at the park." She reached out and placed the clip on top of Caleb's keyboard. Caleb stared at the clip. He looked up at Evelyn, realizing exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just giving him a hair clip. She was telling everyone in the room that she knew his daughter, that they had spent Sunday together, and that he had been in her car. Brad's jaw literally dropped. The blue folder in his hand suddenly looked very heavy. "Yesterday?" Brad stammered. "In your car?" Evelyn turned her head slowly. She looked at Brad for the first time since she stepped out of the elevator. Her eyes were like ice. "Is there a problem, Mr. Smith?" No, ma'am. I mean, yes. Miller here. He stole the Q3 audit. I found it in his desk." Brad held up the blue folder, but his hand was shaking now. "He's a thief. I was just calling security." Evelyn looked at the folder, then back at Brad. "That's interesting. Chloe, when did we send the Q3 audit to the records department for scanning?" Chloe looked at her tablet. "We didn't, ma'am. The Q3 audit is currently under a security lock in your office. It isn't scheduled for archiving until next month. Brad turned pale. But I had it. I brought it over. And why did you have a locked executive file in your possession, Brad? Evelyn asked. She stepped closer to him. She was shorter than Brad, but she seemed to tower over him. And why is it in the records department when you know the protocol is for Chloe to handle all tax documents? I thought I'd get a head start, Brad said. I found it on the printer. The executive printer is behind 2 badge swipe doors, Chloe said without looking up from her screen. The employees in the crowd started to murmur. The whispers weren't about Caleb anymore. They were about Brad. Trevor had backed away from Brad entirely, trying to blend into the shadows of the break room doorway. Evelyn turned back to Caleb. She reached out and touched his arm, the same arm that Brad had called dishonest just minutes ago. Are you okay, Caleb? She asked. I'm fine, Caleb said. He looked at Marcus. Is Marcus okay? Evelyn looked at the security guard. Marcus, I'd like you to go to the clinic on the 2nd floor and get your shoulder checked out. Put it on the company's tab. I'm all right, miss. Vance, Marcus said, though he was rubbing his arm. Go anyway, Evelyn said. Then she looked at Brad. Mr. Smith, my office, now, Chloe. Call the head of HR and tell them to meet us on the 45th floor. Evelyn didn't wait for a response. She turned and started walking back toward the executive elevator. Caleb, she said, pausing at the doors, don't forget the clip. I'll see you later. The elevator doors closed. The office stayed silent for a long time. Caleb looked at the pink butterfly clip on his keyboard. He picked it up and tucked it into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. He looked at Brad. Brad was standing in the middle of the floor, his face the color of ash. He looked like a man who had just realized he had walked into a trap of his own making. Miller, Brad whispered. I didn't know. I know you didn't, Caleb said. Caleb sat back down in his chair and pulled a new file toward him. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Trevor. He just started working. The sound of his typing was the only noise on the floor as Brad slowly walked toward the stairs, leaving the stolen folder on a random desk. Every person in that office was staring at Caleb. They weren't seeing a clerk anymore. They were seeing the man who had the queen of the company on speed dial. Caleb didn't care about that. He just thought about Ava's face when he'd give her the clip back. He thought about Saturday at the park. He felt safe. For the first time in 6 years, he felt like he wasn't fighting the war alone. Evelyn stood by the elevator doors, but she didn't step inside yet. She turned her head and looked at Brad, who was still holding the blue folder. The rest of the office was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Mr. Smith, Evelyn said, I've already reviewed the system logs from this morning. That tax file was accessed from your terminal at 8:15 a.m. You didn't find it on a printer. You printed it yourself. Chloe, handle the HR paperwork. Brad didn't say anything. He didn't try to explain himself or shout. He just looked down at the folder in his hands. The aggressive man who had been yelling at Caleb a few minutes ago was gone. He looked small. Miss Vance, I can explain, Brad said, his voice barely a whisper. There is nothing to explain, Brad. You bypassed executive security to frame a records clerk. That is a criminal matter, not just a company one. Chloe will meet you in your office. Evelyn stepped into the elevator, and the doors slid shut. Brad stood in the middle of the aisle for a long time. He looked over at Trevor, but Trevor was staring intensely at his computer screen, pretending to be busy. None of the 30 people who had been watching the show earlier would look at Brad now. The wall of authority he had built around himself had completely collapsed. Brad walked slowly back to his glass-walled office. Through the windows, the entire department watched him grab a cardboard box from under his desk. He started taking things off his shelves, a World's Best Boss mug, a brass desk clock, and a few framed awards. He walked out of his office 5 minutes later, carrying the box. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't say goodbye. The only sound was the heavy thud of his footsteps as he walked toward the exit. Trevor kept his head down, refusing to acknowledge the man he had been laughing with just an hour ago. Caleb sat at his desk, watching Brad disappear through the heavy doors. He felt a strange lack of victory. He wasn't happy to see a man lose his job, but he felt a massive weight lift off his chest. "Caleb?" He looked up. Chloe was standing there. She wasn't carrying her tablet anymore. "Miss, Vance would like to see you upstairs," Chloe said. "Marcus will cover your desk for a few minutes." Caleb stood up and followed her to the executive elevator. They rode in silence to the 45th floor. When the doors opened, the world looked different. The carpets were thicker, the air smelled like expensive candles, and the windows showed the entire Puget Sound. Evelyn was standing by the window in her office. She had taken off her blazer and was standing in a white silk blouse. "Is Brad gone?" Evelyn asked as Caleb walked in. "He just left," Caleb said. Caleb walked closer to her, stopping a few feet away. He looked at the vast office, then back at her. "Why did you do it, Evelyn? You could have just had Chloe call HR. You didn't have to come down there yourself. You didn't have to bring the hair clip." Evelyn turned around. She looked tired, despite the perfect bun and the expensive clothes. She looked at Caleb, and for a second, he saw the woman from the park again. "He was trying to take away your life, Caleb," Evelyn said. "He was going to take your job, your reputation, and your ability to take care of Ava, all because he was jealous. I know, but you put yourself at risk. People are going to talk. They're going to ask how the CEO knows a clerk's daughter. Let them talk," Evelyn said. "But why? Why go through all that for me?" Evelyn stepped closer to him. She looked at the butterfly clip sticking out of his shirt pocket. "Because justice shouldn't be a luxury, Caleb," Evelyn said. "In that office downstairs, men like Brad think they can buy the truth. They think, because they have a title and a bigger paycheck, they can crush whoever they want. I spent a long time being crushed by people like that before I got this chair. I promised myself I wouldn't let it happen in my building." Caleb nodded. "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you for this." "You already did," Evelyn said. "You treated me like a person on Saturday. Not like a boss, and not like a monster. That's worth more than anything I did today." Caleb reached out and took her hand. It was the first time they had touched in the office. Her skin was cool, but her grip was firm. "I should get back to work," Caleb said. "Take the rest of the day off, Caleb. Go pick up Ava early. I think you both need it." Caleb smiled. "I think you're right." He walked out of the office, feeling like a warrior who had finally won a long, exhausting battle. He wasn't just a records clerk anymore. He was a man with a future. Caleb walked back onto the 15th floor to grab his backpack. The office felt like a completely different place than it had 2 hours ago. The whispers were still there, but the tone had shifted. People watched him walk to his cubicle with a quiet, cautious respect. Marcus stood by the elevators and gave him a short nod as he passed. "Have a good night, Caleb," Marcus said. "You too, Marcus. Take care of that shoulder." Caleb didn't stay to chat. He packed his things, took the pink butterfly clip out of his pocket to make sure it was safe, and headed for the exit. He walked out of the Aegis Global Tower and into the cooling Seattle evening. The rain had stopped, leaving the sidewalks damp and reflecting the neon lights of the city. He started his usual walk toward the King Street station to catch the Sounder train back to Kent. His mind was racing with everything that had happened. He thought about Brad's empty office and the way Evelyn had stood up for him. He felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. He was halfway to the station when he noticed a sleek black Tesla pulled up at the curb just ahead of him. The passenger window slid down with a faint hum. Evelyn Vance was sitting in the driver's seat. She had her glasses on and had let her hair down completely. "I heard Sarah is working late tonight," Evelyn said. "Need a ride to pick up Ava?" Caleb stopped and looked at her. "How did you know about Sarah's shift?" "I called the diner. I wanted to make sure Ava didn't have to stay at the after-school program longer than necessary. Sarah said she's covering a double." Caleb hesitated for a second, looking at the luxury car and then at his own scuffed shoes. "You've already done enough for me today, Evelyn. You don't need to be my chauffeur. Get in the car, Caleb. It's on my way home anyway." Caleb opened the door and sat in the leather passenger seat. The interior of the car was pristine and smelled faintly of expensive perfume and new car scent. He felt a bit out of place with his worn backpack on his lap, but as Evelyn pulled back into traffic, the tension in his shoulders began to fade. The car was quiet. It wasn't the awkward, heavy silence he was used to with strangers. It felt comfortable, like they had been doing this for years. Evelyn drove with a steady, confident hand, navigating the busy Seattle streets toward the freeway. "Thank you," Caleb said after a few minutes, "for everything. I still can't believe how fast it all happened." "Brad made it easy," Evelyn said. "Men like him always get sloppy because they think they're untouchable. He practically handed me the evidence. What will happen to him? HR is handling the termination. The legal department is deciding if they want to file charges for the security breach. Either way, he won't be bothering you again." Caleb nodded, looking out the window at the city lights. "It's going to be weird going back to that floor tomorrow without him hovering over everyone." "You won't be going back to that floor tomorrow," Evelyn said. Caleb turned to look at her. "What do you mean? Am I being moved? We'll talk about that tomorrow morning. For now, just focus on being a dad." "What are you doing for dinner tonight?" "I was going to make some chicken soup," Caleb said. "Ava's been asking for it since yesterday. I have some star-shaped pasta in the pantry that she likes. Homemade? Yeah, it's cheaper that way, and I can control what goes into it. I usually put in a lot of carrots because that's the only way I can get her to eat vegetables." Evelyn smiled. "My mom used to do the same thing. She called it magic soup, so I wouldn't ask too many questions about the onions." "I might have to steal that name," Caleb said. "Do you cook much?" "Not as much as I'd like. My schedule usually results in takeout or frozen meals. My kitchen is mostly for show these days." "That's a shame. Cooking is the only time I really get to clear my head." "Well, except for when Ava tries to help and ends up getting flour on the ceiling. It sounds nice," Evelyn said quietly. "The noise. The mess. It sounds like a home." Caleb looked at her. He saw the way she looked at the road, her profile silhouetted by the passing streetlights. Despite the title in the car, she sounded lonely. "It is," Caleb said. "It's a lot of work, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. Even on the days when the car won't start and the bills are piling up, I think I'm starting to understand that," Evelyn said. They reached the after-school center a few minutes later. Evelyn pulled up to the front and put the car in park. "I'll wait here," she said. "You don't have to. I can take the bus from here. I'm not leaving you at a bus stop with a 6-year-old and a bag of groceries. Caleb, go get her." Caleb walked into the center and found Ava sitting at a small table, drawing. When she saw him, she let out a yell and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his legs. "You're early, Daddy. I got a ride," Caleb said, picking her up. "And guess who's in the car?" Ava's eyes went wide. "Is it the warrior lady?" "It is." Ava scrambled out of his arms and ran toward the door. Caleb followed her, a smile on his face. As he watched his daughter wave frantically at the black Tesla, he realized that the long, exhausting commute he had endured for years didn't feel so long anymore. He had someone waiting for him, and for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The apartment in Kent was small, and the front door tended to stick when it rained, but as Caleb pushed it open, the air felt different. It didn't smell like the sterilized executive floors of Aegis Global or the damp, cold sidewalks of downtown Seattle. It smelled like cedarwood air freshener and old books. "Sorry about the mess," Caleb said, kicking a stray sneaker out of the walkway. "I haven't had a chance to do a deep clean since Wednesday." Evelyn stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. It was a modest space. A well-worn sofa sat in front of a small television, and the walls were covered in Ava's drawings. "It's not a mess, Caleb. It looks like people actually live here. I like it. Make yourself at home. I'm going to get that soup started." Ava dropped her backpack by the door and scrambled toward the closet. "I'm going to get the crayons." "Evelyn, do you want to draw while Daddy cooks?" "I'd love to," Evelyn said. Caleb went into the kitchen and pulled a pot from the cabinet. He started chopping carrots and celery, the rhythmic thud of the knife against the wooden board grounding him. He looked over the counter into the living room. Evelyn had taken off her blazer and draped it over the back of a chair. She was wearing a loose, oversized gray t-shirt that Caleb had found for her in the laundry room, one of his old ones that had been washed so many times it was soft as silk. The wide neckline of the shirt shifted as she sat on the floor with Ava, exposing the silver and red scar tissue on her shoulder. She didn't reach up to pull the fabric back in place. She didn't try to hide. She just sat there, her arm resting naturally on the carpet. Ava had the green and gold Crayola box open. She was using the built-in sharpener on a cerulean crayon, her tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth in concentration. "I'm drawing the tree again," Ava said. "But this time it's going to have a birdhouse." "That's a good idea," Evelyn said. "What color is the birdhouse?" "Purple, because birds like bright colors." Caleb turned back to the stove, sliding the vegetables into the pot with the chicken broth. He felt a strange sense of peace. He had spent so many years in this kitchen alone, worrying about the future and feeling the weight of the silence. Now, the apartment was filled with the sound of Ava's chatter and the scratch of wax on paper. "Dinner's ready," Caleb called out 20 minutes later. They sat at the small wooden table in the kitchen corner. The soup was hot and simple, served with a side of buttered toast. There were no expensive appetizers or silver utensils, just 3 people eating a meal under the warm yellow glow of the overhead light. "Is it magic soup, Evelyn?" Ava asked, blowing on a spoonful of broth. Evelyn smiled, taking a bite. "It definitely is. I think the star-shaped pasta makes it extra powerful. Daddy makes it when I feel sad," Ava said. "It fixes everything." "I can see why," Evelyn said. She looked at Caleb over her bowl. "Thank you for having me, Caleb. I can't remember the last time I had a home-cooked meal that wasn't eaten over a laptop." "You're welcome anytime," Caleb said. "I know it's not the 4-course meals you're used to, but the company is better." "Much better," she agreed. They talked about small things, Ava's upcoming school play, the best places to find hiking trails near Mount Rainier, and how Sarah always managed to burn the toast at the diner. They didn't talk about Brad or the records department. They didn't talk about CEOs or tax audits. They were just Caleb, Evelyn, and Ava. After dinner, Ava dragged the sketchbook back to the sofa. "Evelyn, you have to help me finish the warrior lady. She needs her cape." Evelyn sat back down on the floor, picking up a red crayon. She carefully began to color in a flowing cape behind the stick figure they had started at the park. Caleb finished drying the dishes and walked over, standing behind them. "She looks tough," Caleb said, looking at the drawing. "She's a survivor," Evelyn said, her voice quiet. Ava yawned, her head drooping toward Evelyn's shoulder. The long day of excitement was finally catching up to her. Within minutes, her eyes fluttered shut and her breathing became slow and steady. "I should get her to bed," Caleb whispered. He picked Ava up gently and carried her into the small bedroom. He tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and made sure her favorite stuffed rabbit was within reach. When he walked back into the living room, Evelyn was still sitting on the floor, looking at the finished drawing. Caleb sat down on the sofa behind her. He reached out and placed his hand on hers. His skin was rough and calloused from years of manual labor and office work, his knuckles slightly scarred from old accidents. Evelyn's hand was smaller, her skin marked by the ridges of the fire that had tried to take her life. He didn't say anything. He didn't make a grand declaration or a promise of forever. He just let his hand rest there, his fingers intertwining with hers. Evelyn leaned her head back against the sofa, closing her eyes. She didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, her thumb tracing the lines of his palm. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. "Then don't," Caleb said. "Stay a while. The rain isn't going anywhere." Outside, the Seattle sky finally opened up again. The rain drummed against the window pane, a steady, rhythmic sound that usually made Caleb feel isolated. But inside the apartment, the sound didn't feel lonely. It felt like a barrier, keeping the rest of the world away. They sat there in the quiet for a long time. There were no cameras, no employees, no expectations. They weren't a CEO and a clerk. They were just 2 people who had been through the fire and found a way to keep walking. They were simply together, safe, and still. The city outside was cold and gray, but inside the small apartment in Kent, they had finally found exactly what they were looking for. They had found home. And that is our bedtime story for tonight. As we leave Caleb, Evelyn, and little Ava in the quiet warmth of their home, I have to ask, how did this story make you feel? Did it change the way you look at the scars people carry, whether they are visible on the skin or hidden deep within the heart? Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. We truly appreciate your time and your presence here. This journey reminds us of a very important lesson. Our wounds do not define our worth. They are not marks of shame or signs of being broken. They are proof that we were stronger than the fire that tried to consume us. Whether you are facing a difficult boss, a lonely house, or a past you're trying to outrun, remember that your value is found in your resilience and the kindness you offer to others. We take pride in sharing these single dad stories because they highlight the quiet heroism found in everyday life. Caleb's journey shows us that being a single dad is about more than just survival. It's about building a world of color and safety for those we love, even when we have very little to give. May this story inspire you to look past the surface and find the warrior in everyone you meet. Thank you for listening. Sleep well, and remember that no matter how heavy the rain falls outside, you have the power to find your own place to belong. Good night.